Hey everyone, welcome to Expansion Cast. Expansion Cast is a magical podcast I created so people could find simple or unconventional solutions to expand their personal awareness and experience. This podcast is dedicated towards revealing people's divine truth and how that divine truth works its way out into the world, one by one, helping liberate each of us on our personal path to freedom. If you love this podcast, please give us a rating and share. Hey everyone, welcome to Expansion Cast. Today on this episode we have Dolphin Kasper. Dolphin is a coach, speaker, and facilitator at Evolve Now. He has delivered over 2,000 talks, workshops, and programs to over 100,000 people. He has coached nearly every imaginable demographic. So please welcome Dolphin Kasper. Dolphin, we don't know each other, but welcome to Expansion Cast, man.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So what's happening for you these days? It feels like you've had a shift.
To me, the whole context of the coronavirus and the pandemic and the human global response to it has been striking. I think on a lot of levels. My life, in terms of what my days look like, of course, it's fairly sequestered. It's quiet and slower than usual. There's obviously less social interaction. But the funny thing is the last year or so for me was kind of like a sabbatical. I hadn't worked in the traditional sense for about a year and a half now. And so I was actually just in the process of getting a couple of my businesses started again after taking some time away. And so it felt like, God, the divine, the world said, sit back down, not quite yet. So it's been getting used to having less to do and less going on, but also knowing that as much as I enjoy the quiet spaces, that there's an opportunity to cultivate and to grow in this time that I think is unprecedented. And that goes for everyone. There's a pause that's been struck on the status quo, on the usual functioning of the world. And if we're interested, there's an opportunity to look and see things that we've never seen before. So I've been really enjoying taking advantage of that opportunity.
And when you say take a look at see things that you haven't had a chance to see before, is that internal, external? What are you seeing?
Everywhere. But I'm really a strong believer that what we see externally is always a reflection of what's going on inside of us. Yeah. And in fact, the neuroscience and the research around that is quite clear that we essentially project onto the world and then make sense of the world through that projection. So that it is true that what we see is dependent on what's going on in us. And for me, the important factors of that are the culture that has grown over the last several decades is very much a doing culture, that it's very much based on having, doing, experiencing. It's all quite coarse. It's all quite on the surface, I would say. And when things slow down, and I think we've all had this, when things slow down, we become aware of things that we weren't aware of before, just by virtue of slowing down. In fact, I would say, if anyone has struggled with meditation or mindfulness or a particular practice around those, what I would often say to them is just do things more slowly. Just by virtue of doing things more slowly, we naturally become aware of the more that's always there, but outside of our awareness because we're trying to track all of the loud busyness on the surface. So to me, there's an opportunity to listen and to see levels and dimensions of reality that have always been there, but we haven't necessarily taken the time and slowed down enough to register them. And in a real way, those subtle things are more important than all the big loud things. If you want to think of it like science, none of the vehicles and spaces and buildings and all of the stuff of human culture, none of that's possible without the tiniest, like quantum. All of that is dependent on these invisible tiny levels of reality. And inside of us, it's the same. All of the big, loud, obvious things in us as a person, our personality, our emotions, how we do things, our skills, all of that's built and dependent on things that are far smaller and subtler than those. And when we become aware of what kind of the constituents of us are and start to work with them, it's like the difference between putting a band-aid on something and getting to the heart of what's actually going on. So,
Yeah.
if you have an illness in your system and it manifests as some kind of lesion on your skin, the band-aid is worse than useless, because then it makes you feel like it's better, but you're not addressing the problem. So the real opportunity I see right now is that we can listen into where what we've called our problems have actually come from, the real genesis or origin of those things. And if we're willing, start to work with them in a way that will make all the difference moving forward.
Yeah, I believe that too. Now, it was interesting that you said that what we see in the world is a reflection of us. So, with everything you just said, I'm listening to you and seeing all this stuff that you're talking about as a reflection of your changes that you're going through. So, what are you going through? Like, what kind of changes? What's the real changes you can share with us, whether they're vulnerable or whatever, just to show that you're not above the same changes that everybody else is going through?
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, there is, of course, a heightened sense of uncertainty in my life. And I think uncertainty is a piece that I've tried to avoid. And I think a lot of people can relate to this, is a lot of the striving in our world, a lot of the success, a lot of the desire to be somebody and do something great is actually a kind of coping against a sense of inadequacy and against a sense of insecurity. And so what do you do when there's nothing to do and there's nowhere to get to and there's nothing to create and there's no one special to be? It's just actually about being human. So for me, I've been facing dimensions of that or flavors of that. And there's just been an opportunity for me to see more deeply that old patterning in me. I've worked with it a lot. I've really put a lot of it to rest. And I think we have this idea, a lot of people, especially if you've been in the personal growth space, we have this idea that if we get it right, or if we, enlightenment is sometimes seen that way. It's like the answer, and then it'll all be good after that. And everything that I've experienced and understood and taught says that it's just, there's no destination like that. There's always next. Even if you have a great awakening or you become enlightened, if you're one of the special ones, the Zen saying, which I love, is before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference is that you're all there in the chopping of the wood and the carrying of the water, versus before enlightenment, you weren't all there.
Yeah. So to sum up, what you're saying is that everything that's been happening for you has been creating more awareness.
Yeah, and opportunity to be with things that, as I started with, like when I'm busy, when I got a lot going on, when I'm juggling a lot of things, I don't necessarily give myself the time or the space to be with them. So in this time of a slowdown, in this time of having maybe less to do or less opportunity to build outwardly, there's a natural opportunity to come inside, and maybe we have an idea that we'd love to come into our inner space and that it's all just light and love and joy and bliss, when the reality is that there's just more of life there. And all of it. So the light, the dark, the difficult, the easy, the pleasurable, the painful. I just feel like I've had more opportunity to be with all of that and to be honest with myself about, oh yeah, that's the state of things inside. And I really have learned to see that as a beautiful opportunity. So when I come to dirty little corners that maybe I haven't cleaned up yet, I go, oh, a sweet opportunity. Doesn't feel good, but it's a sweet opportunity to get to those places and spaces that I maybe haven't made time and space for.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a bit of a struggle to jump into those spaces and nurture them. But once we get to the other side, it's beautiful, isn't it? And then we do it
Almost
again.
always. Then there's the next. Yeah, exactly.
So, why do you think that certainty is such a huge thing for people? I mean, it seems to be people think that certainty breeds happiness. You think that's true?
No, I think, in fact, it can often be a threat to authentic happiness, at least depending on our orientation. It's interesting that question because I just read the book Ishmael. Have you read it?
No, no.
You know, so it's an interesting book. It essentially is a dialogue about the nature of Western industrialized culture in reference to more native indigenous cultures that are in alignment with nature, and so some of the themes that come through are just about how the creation of stability in terms of food. It was really kind of the agricultural revolution that shifted, that strong shift from hunter-gatherer type societies to these more kind of civilization based agricultural societies, and that brought something that wasn't certain in that way. You couldn't plan your food in a way. If you were in an environment that your community or your village had been in for generations, you knew the food was there, but there could be a drought, there could be a flood, there could be disruptions in the food source, and agriculture changed all of that. And I think there's a predominant belief system that was for the better. And you could make lots of good faith arguments about that. And you could also make lots of good faith arguments against that. That the security that we got from the industrial, or sort of from the agricultural revolution and from the industrial revolution, have bettered things from certain perspectives. And I think in profound ways have left us in a kind of existential limbo in terms of what does it mean to be a living human being where you don't need to survive. You don't need to do anything to survive. That part of the equation is handled by society. What does that leave us with? And I think that's the existential question we're in right now, and have been in for a couple of generations at least, where that's not everyone, but for the most of the planet, that part of our existential equation is handled. Now what? And I don't think we have a coherent, concise answer to the now what. And that's the conversation that I think is most worth having right now, especially in the context of the pandemic.
So, do you have an answer? Do you have some sort of idea?
I do. I mean, I definitely fancy myself some kind of amateur philosopher, and I like to give real thought to these things. And what I come to, I'll kind of weave a couple of things together because I think they're relevant. I think of life as in a funny way, knowing where it's going. So if you took, maybe the life of a tree, if you took just that single organism, which is made up of all sorts of cells and interesting chemistry and biology in the context of a broader system, but like if we just took the tree from seed, in the seed, what's needed for that tree to become its full expression is already there, as long as the environment is favorable and favorable enough. And so halfway through the tree's life, in the context of the tree, that's the first time it's ever reached that stage of development. But in it, all of the information and knowledge necessary to fulfill is there. And I feel like we're in some kind of puberty from the context of life. There's a puberty and a shift. And in a funny way, the shift includes the information that knows where it's all meant to go. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, what does that mean? And how do we use that information to to participate in this coming of age, so to speak. And so to me, I think our nervous system is actually built to shift from a survival context to an evolutionary context. And I think there's actually, if you look at survival and evolution, they're not the same thing, but they work together. And so it's, in essence, when we are occupied with survival in the moment, we close off all sorts of avenues of learning, growth, and development. And in fact, in terms of the brain, we know that the learning centers of the brain, the executive functioning of the brain, essentially goes dark when we're in a fight, flight, or freeze response. And so that's interesting that we have a societal dynamic right now where most people are stressed or in a kind of constant state of fight, flight, or freeze all the time, like the majority of their day. They're in some sense of being on guard against. And in terms of the nervous system doesn't really recognize the difference between that and having a legitimate threat to their life present. And all of that's cutting off our evolutionary potential. And I've also worked enough with my own pieces around fear, and I've worked with other people quite a bit around the dynamic of fear, that when we can create a context where we're okay with the experience of feeling threatened or insecure, we actually reactivate those learning and developmental aspects of our mind and our brain. And we end up deriving massive benefit from the very things that we had been avoiding. And for me, that's the shift. And it's on every level. It's like relationally, if we feel insecure and threatened with someone and we close off and we turn into kind of fight, flight, or freeze, all of the possibility of that relationship get cut off. All of the possibility of us sorting out our past and actually making sense of the present so we can move in the direction of a shared future, like a fundamentally shared future. All of that's not available. So for me, a question in my work and in a question for the world is, how do we start here in my own experience with what feels scary, painful, or threatening? How do I work with the context that I create around that so that I'm able to have it without just coping or reacting? And the beautiful thing, some of my work is around what I define as the three contexts for communication. So I believe that there are three fundamental contexts for communication. One is intrapersonal. That's the communication that's happening within us. And we actually mediate and modulate that communication by how we relate with it, with our experience. And then there's the interpersonal communication, me and another. And that is all dependent, just like I was saying, like the big is dependent on the little. My interpersonal communication is fundamentally dependent on my intrapersonal communication, the communication I'm managing within me. And then there's what I call superpersonal communication. This is the communication that happens not directly through our one-to-one interactions, but any position of authority or leadership we have in our lives kind of has this organic trickle. People are watching us, people are listening to us. We might be setting up ways of being, ways of operating. If we run a business, if we are in the government, if we're in community and we hold any position of authority or leadership, we are participating in a constant state of superpersonal communication, which is dependent on our interpersonal communication, which is dependent on our intrapersonal communication. So it's an inside job conversation, and that I truly believe that as we individually manage and handle and really come wholly into relationship with the internal communication, we then can master the interpersonal, and we then can master the superpersonal. And it has to be that direction. The top-down approach to change doesn't work. It's not how nature works. And in society, it will never be the source of sustainable change and evolution.
Do you not think that communication top down is happening all the time? Just whether our interpersonal communication is open to it gives it power to change us?
I mean, I would say that it's a system, and so information is moving in different directions. But when we're what I would call deeply honest, the honest information is coming from the inside out. So it's a little bit like when we realize some people are able to discern when someone's being honest or not.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, yeah.
So that there's like a spectrum. Some people can spot inauthenticity like in the subtlest form anywhere. They just got it. Other people are essentially blind to it. They have no idea. Maybe you have someone on the autism spectrum, or someone who just has no real ability to track and make sense of what's going on out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we can see the truth out there, or the authenticity of something outside of us, that ability is all dependent on the level of awareness, knowledge, and integration that we have inside. It's like an essential capacity, but that is dependent on a kind of developmental aspect of our inner world. So just like you can kind of, I would liken it to like a skill. So if I'm a world-class musician, I can spot tiny subtle errors, or where the musical piece isn't played quite to the music, or I can see the creative flavor that a musician is adding to what they're playing. If I'm a layman, someone who doesn't know music at all and doesn't know the piece and doesn't know the instrument, I'm going to miss all of that. Mm-hmm. So our ability to see those subtleties is all really, it's developmental in our nervous system. And so that holds true in all of our kind of perceptual pieces. And in that way, the only way we can really accurately and effectively navigate the world and interact with information and discern, I think this is a super key conversation right now. How do we discern the truth from falsehood in the world of technology, where information is constantly flowing in, and not all information is created equal? So this ability to discern is super important for us. And the ability to do that is an inside out movement. It is me relating to what is clear within me. And that clarity within me then allows me to discern information that's really lined up and authentic, and information that somehow has been manipulated or is off the mark. And one of the orientations that's key for that a lot of people are not willing to have is the uncertainty. It's, am I willing to hold off drawing conclusions until there's enough clarity and information for me to go, this I can stand on? And mostly, especially as I've kind of watched and in some ways navigated some of the conversations online in the last few weeks, there's very little availability for that uncertainty. People want to be certain, they want to feel certain, and they will go to war, literally and figuratively, to feel secure in their point of view. And then that's very problematic, especially when the pressures of the current situation come in. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. If we think this is bad, things could get much worse than this. And how will we navigate those difficulties? How will we navigate the interpersonal interactions when things get even more challenging, more uncomfortable? I think it's a real question that if we're not willing to face, will be worse down the road.
A couple of weeks ago, I had a dream, and I had died, and I'm at the gates of heaven, or whatever, the gates of the afterlife, and there was great big wooden pillars, and there was a woman behind each one of them. And I walked up and sat in the chair in front of one pillar, and she said, "Tell me your story." So I started telling her my story, and she cut me off in my story, and she's like, "You lost your faith. That's why you're here." And I was like, and I woke up and I was like, wow, that's crazy, because I mean, that's the root of it all, isn't it? I mean, we have to jump. We have to take a jump. Nothing is certain in life. And if we don't have faith, where are we? And it seems like everything you're saying is tied to faith. But what do you have faith in?
Yeah, and I don't tend to use that word. I don't really have a problem with it. It's just not the word I use. But I think what you said brings me to, and this is a point that I think is really, really juicy and important for us to engage, is what is our relationship with the fundamental nature of life? Is it that life is good, or is it that life is somehow not good? If my relationship with the fundamentals of life is that on some level, in some way, it's just there's a goodness. That doesn't mean warm and fuzzy. That doesn't mean easy. That doesn't mean fair. But there's a kind of goodness to life. And you feel that goodness when you watch a nature program and you're watching the ecosystem, how it functions, how animals and plants are interplaying, how they feed each other, how one eats another, which eats another, and there's this balance and a kind of harmony that resonates with us. We love it. Now, the reality of living in that nature context is not secure for the individual organism. It's secure for the system. And so for me, I have absolute faith in the fundamental goodness of the system of life, of the system of reality. And in the context of that, all sorts of difficulty and pain and challenge exists. Mm-hmm. They're not at odds with each other. The problem is when we believe we're entitled to a good life, to an easy life, to a pleasant life. And then we hold the difficulties of our life up against that idea, that false idea. And then, of course, the natural conclusion is that life is a problem, this life, this world, this society. And it takes us away from the faith that you're talking about, which is first, life is this incredibly beautiful, complex organism that has the mobility and the capacity for unimaginable expression and creativity and joy. And equally to that, the pain and the difficulty and the challenge is a fabric. It's woven into it with no difficulty, with no pain. There's no depth and there's no perspective. So they can't be separated. And I think our biggest challenge as human beings is we've tried to separate what we think is good and nice and fun about life from what is hard and difficult and not fun. And now we're stuck, and that's an unsolvable existential problem, because it's actually disingenuous to life. It's not honest to life. And then what do we do? So if I have an idea of how life should be, and then I have this picture or this direct experience of how life is, and they're not matched up, I need to do one of two things. I need to make myself wrong for it, or I need to make the world and the people that make up this world a problem for it. And when you look at how we are, when we look at mental health and mental illness, addiction, when we look at societal issues, when we look at how people and governments are interacting, it's just rife with all of that. Mistrust, blame, and shame, because individually we're not choosing to first be okay with life as it is. And I know that's not an easy ask. I just know that it's our way forward if we really want to do it in a way that's sustainable and holistic.
Absolutely. I think we've been taught over and over again what a good life is and what we should be trying to achieve, how hard we should be working, all these things that really don't take us anywhere. They don't give us quality of life, because quality of life is really in how we interpret and accept events that are coming our way. I know I talk to lots of clients who have a huge, when we talk about emotion, like if it's anger, it's way over to the one side, and joy is way over to the other side. And most people can't find joy in anger. They can't find joy in sadness. But what happens when we can find joy and love in all emotions? Man, it just changes a person's whole life. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and what I'll point to actually, and that's a really lovely point that you're making, is we have a couple of choices when we get to, say, an aspect of life like an emotion, and we've made it wrong somehow. We can approach it kind of from the outside. We can try to make sense of, okay, well, anger is like this, and here's how I'm being with it, and I can change how I'm being with anger, and that can be effective. And one of the other things that can be really effective with challenging emotion, especially fear, anger, sadness, these are the ones that we tend to label as negative or bad, is to have a somatic practice when the emotion arises, because emotion and physical experience are very much connected and interwoven.
Mm-hmm.
And what we discover when we get into a deep somatic practice with our emotion is that what we call anger is actually a constellation of thoughts and feelings and experiences. What we call sadness, it's not like your anger always is exactly the same. Especially when you start to really subtly relate to it, you start to feel, oh, this is more intense than yesterday, or this, I feel this in my stomach, and yesterday it was in my shoulder. Or you start to get all of this variability in the experience of anger. And when you get into a really deep practice of that, you start to dissolve what you've called anger. You start to recognize that anger is a label or a category of constellations of experiences, and you've oversimplified. And one of the things that actually becomes a really common natural consequence of a deep somatic practice with emotion is we find that underlying all of the experiences of those emotions, there is a natural joy that's there. I would call it a joy of being.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to kind of reconnect with it is to release our hold on what labeling and judging anger does for us, what labeling and judging sadness does for us. There's a payoff in how we've held emotion. And when we let go of that payoff, we start to come into just the essential experience in the body, in the mind, in the emotion. And again, this has been so common in the work that I've done, is that we don't have to try to do joy. We don't have to create affirmations and gratitude practices around joy. It is what all of our experience arises out of. There is this joy of being. You see it in a baby very easily. Even in their crying, there's this fullness of expression, and it's ecstatic. Sadness, pain, discomfort. There's an ecstasy in the expression because it's unhindered. It's not, there's no parameters or holding in it. And as adults, we can come back to that way of being in our emotion, and there's some surrendering that's required. There's some pieces that we need to let go of. So it's a great example.
So what do you think the benefits are? Like, what's the payoff? Like, why do people keep doing this? Why do they keep riding this old horse?
I would say the primary payoff is the sense of self we get from being the one with the anger, from being the one with the fear, from being the one with the sadness. So if I have been mistreated, if I've been hurt or abused in my life, and there are these, that's sort of like a common anger, fear, sadness. Those are very common emotions when we've experienced difficulty and trauma. And then we cope as best we can because we're survival organisms on one level. And then we end up identifying with the coping strategies and the experiences that go along with them. And so then identity, coping mechanisms, and experience all get woven together into this is who I am. So the letting go of the labeling and the value judgment of emotion is also the letting go of our sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a really uncomfortable feeling, because in a way we've grounded our sense of security in our sense of self. So then what you're doing is you're saying, step into this painful, uncomfortable, uncertain place and step away from what has been more secure, more familiar, it feels more safe.
Yeah,
even if it's emotions that you say you don't want. Underlying that desire to be rid of your anger or your fear or your anxiety is your attachment to sense of self and identity. So in a way, that's the inescapable path for someone that wants to be free of the negative relationship with emotion, is they also have to be free of their hold, their attachment, and their use of their sense of self to cope.
Mm-hmm. So I had a interview a week ago or 2 weeks ago with a Swami, and he said that the biggest hurdle we have is misunderstanding, and that's really our only hurdle, is to beat that misunderstanding and move beyond it. And I think misunderstanding is quite an interesting. Maybe it's a simple concept, because, like you say, when we're in this what we consider a safe place, like I use the story of going down a river and there's some rapids coming up. You've never been in rapids. You're by yourself. You have an anchor and you throw it out and your boat ends up in the rapids. So what do? Maybe you're scared. There's a whole bunch of trauma happening, but you feel safe because your anchor's holding you still. And after a while, you just become accustomed to the rapids, and you're just bouncing around and living that way, but you become okay with it. And the surrender is in going and pulling the anchor out and continuing your journey. And I think maybe that sums up what you're saying, but the certainty is an illusion, because the certainty is the anchor, giving you the illusion of safety. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it's a good analogy. And in life, it seems counterintuitive, but some people favor the rapids, as dangerous and uncomfortable as they can be, because they've become accustomed to them and they've identified themselves with them. So for some people, when life gets calm and quote unquote good, safe, healthy, they freak out. I worked with homeless youth for a number of years, and it's incredible to see what happens when you have essentially a child that's been living on the street for a few years, and then they get their own apartment and they actually go back to the street. I think a lot of people have ideas about, social work and working with really challenging populations, that they just need resources, that if we just housed them all and gave them food, and it would all be good. And I'm not saying that resources aren't really helpful. It's just on its own not enough. Because if that person isn't able to create a new context for their life and a new context for what's difficult about life, they will naturally gravitate back to whatever is most familiar to them. Even if that familiarity includes hardship and abuse and violence and drugs and death, they will go back to it.
Yeah, because they still experience the same misunderstanding. I can give somebody light, and that's not going to help them. They have to come to it themselves.
Yeah. And I would say that it's not actually understanding, that there is something that precedes understanding that's more key, because you can give someone all of the information. The answer can be staring them dead in the face, and they won't see it. Not because it's too difficult to understand, but because they don't want to understand. Because on some level, they know that understanding is the end of their old life, and the end of their coping and their practiced mechanisms of feeling secure in some way.
Right. So, but there's still a deeper misunderstanding.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's more essential than understanding. And understanding, to me, brings it into a mental recognition. To understand something is like you can see it, you can maybe explain it. Mm-hmm. But there's something that precedes the understanding that is more like our willingness to be with life as it is. That clear seeing and understanding all naturally arise out of our willingness to be with life as it is.
So you would say that every time that you have, let's say, a change in how you experience the world, maybe something that brings you more ease, more equanimity, that there was no understanding that shifted your perception and allowed you to drop into a new paradigm?
I would say that it's ultimately dependent on the context you're creating. In other words, you can see information and dots can connect for you, and then you can experience equanimity, and you could draw the conclusion that the equanimity came from the understanding. But if you get more deeply into how our system actually functions, what you would end up seeing is that you had a relationship with understanding that was, when you don't understand, you feel insecure and not at ease. And when you do understand, you feel at ease. And so then you relax. So then the information came, you felt secure in the information, you then relaxed because you felt secure in the information, and you experienced a sense of equanimity. So you had a conditional relationship with being with life as it is. You wanted the information and the understanding, and then you are willing, because of that, to be in a balanced state. What I'm suggesting is that you don't need the information or the understanding to be in that balanced state in relationship to life as it is. It's actually our most natural state of being.
Mm-hmm.
We need to actually work to not be in balanced relationship with life.
What you're talking about is that at our most basic, essential beingness, we're beautiful divine beings that have no struggle, basically. I don't know if, would you say that's accurate as what you're saying?
I would say that we're actually most essentially a kind of creative space. And then from that, in the space, we have form, we have a being, we have physicality.
Right.
And the space we create for that physicality informs and inspires how that physicality develops. So the way I try to make sense of that is, you have two people and they experience something very traumatic and difficult. And as they grow and develop out of that traumatic experience, one of them becomes quite closed off, quite restricted,
because
tight,
of misunderstanding,
because of their unwillingness to be with life as it is.
Because that would be rooted in misunderstanding, right?
Well, the misunderstanding develops, but the misunderstanding is sourced in an unwillingness to be with life as it is. So the person who's not willing to be with life as it is as a result of a trauma is going to develop a way of being and a way of interacting that's closed off, that's reactive. The person that experiences the trauma and is consistently willing to be with life as it is will develop depth, perspective, presence, resilience. So these are human people, human systems that experience an insult to their system that throws them out of equilibrium. And then the aftermath is full of choices. Choices fundamentally about, am I willing to just be with what's there and work with it? Or am I in some way trying to avoid or get away from what's there? And that choice is about how we are with life, how we relate within life. So to me, that's the centerpiece of the development of our system. It's the centerpiece of our healing. It's the centerpiece of our ability to fulfill our potential.
So would you say people have a destiny? I mean, that's kind of a cliche question, but I think it's relevant.
I believe in destiny, and I don't believe it's a singular or static destiny.
Mm-hmm. So,
I think, and it's exactly what I was just talking about. Our willingness to be with life as is transforms our destiny.
yes.
If I'm at odds with life as it is, then the likelihood that I just recycle the patterning and conditioning of my past is essentially guaranteed. The more I'm willing to just be with life as is, without resistance, without avoidance, this whole space of possibility opens up. It's actually neurologically how we function. If I'm in fight, flight, or freeze, I am going to use my most practiced pathways to function. They're the most efficient, they're the most powerful, they're the most trustworthy. We use them when we have no other choice and we have to survive. The moment I create a new context, an evolutionary context instead of a survival context for my life, I now open up all of these branch pathways that are less developed, that weren't available before when I had this resistance. My resistance to life locks me in the most established pathways, locks me in my current trajectory of destiny. The moment I open to life, the moment I'm willing for it to just be as it is without it needing to change or be better, all of this new space and new pathways of possibility open up, new pathways of choice open up. And I believe that is true for everyone. If you have conscious awareness, presence, and recognition of choice in life, you are responsible for the trajectory of your destiny. And a lot of people don't want that responsibility because it's much easier to just blame, to make someone or something wrong, including ourselves, and to not be responsible for the real possibility and potential that is like what we're made of. This genetic information, this physical system, this consciousness that's of us and in us is so ripe with potential, and mostly we're not accessing it because the road to fulfilling potential is not an easy road. Anyone that tells you it's an easy road or a fun road or full of just lollipops and sunshine is trying to sell you something.
Totally agreed. And I think it blows my mind sometimes that people don't want that responsibility, because I mean that's where like the most amazing payoffs are. That's where life gets its transcendent beauty, is when, I mean, yeah, it might be more difficult, but wow, what an amazing place to be.
And what's neat is that very ordinary people, people who have had nothing to do with personal growth or spirituality or any of that stuff, get clear about that, usually when they have a near-death experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one recommendation I will give to clients or just to people out there for the podcast, for people listening, is the more we can, in a healthy, open-hearted way, keep our death close to us in our living, the more perspective we have about the opportunity of life, about the magic and the potential of life. The sense that death is some kind of terrible thing and that we should live forever, and or we just sweep it under the carpet and pretend as though we're immortal beings, which is kind of how a lot of people navigate. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to bring it up. Our approach to the pandemic is heavily rooted in our sense that death is bad, that death is to be avoided at all costs. And I know that'll probably light some people up and get some attention or some resistance, but it's not that I think dying is good. I just know it's not bad. As part of a living system, it's integral. It has to happen. And I really believe that some of what's not grounded and rooted and holistic and responsive to how we've approached this pandemic globally is rooted in this unresolved avoidance of and making wrong of death.
Mm-hmm. So what part do you think is going to light people up? Because let's light them up.
Yeah, well, it's that are we overreacting? And I've asked that question a couple of times in the last few weeks. Are we really implementing the best possible plan? Are vaccines the best idea in terms of approaching these kinds of illnesses? People come back with extremely rigid, righteous responses, wrong-making, essentially insulting me, telling me I don't know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And in the context of maximizing human life, avoiding human fatality maximally, I get that response.
Right.
I'm just asking the honest question, is that the priority? Like, if we looked at deaths from cardiovascular illness or stroke because of lifestyle, what kind of resources and response and mobilization are we putting into creating a society where people don't kill themselves out of basically addictive behaviors? Where I think over 80% of our healthcare budget goes to keeping people alive when they're ill at the end of their lives. I don't want old people to die. That's not what I'm advocating. I'm asking the honest question about what is our relationship with life. So essentially, what the underlying unconscious narrative that I hear is from the arguments is death is bad. We should be able to live and do whatever we want, however we want, and not have to pay consequences for it. Like that's and then we'll use technology and intervention as a way to mitigate the costs and risks of the lifestyles we've chosen.
But the people with the lifestyles that have the cardiovascular issues, I mean, I don't want to get a lot of people sending me hate mail here either, but a lot of people want to die. I mean, that's their choice. The lifestyle they choose, the lazy lifestyle of not taking responsibility and doing your 8 to 10,000 steps a day or whatever it is that you need to do to to live. Yeah, I feel that those people actually want to die. So, but then we're spending all sorts of money to, allow them to live longer or to medicate them for years and years and years.
And they're legally not allowed to die, right?
Yeah.
So that's interesting. We've created a capitalistic system that caters to immediate satisfaction of very superficial wants and needs that kill us, no question. And then you're not allowed to die. We will actually we will force medicine on you to keep you alive. Now, of course, there's lots of variability and nuance in this scope that we just opened up.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a funny thing. Like if you say you were an alien coming from outer space and you were to look at human society, you would kind of scratch your head and go, what is going on down there? Like, what are these people doing? And I'm not even saying I have the answer. But when I look at our systems, when I look at our systems of healthcare, when I look at our systems of mental health support, when I look at our systems of government, when I look at our systems of food, very little makes sense to me. Of course, it serves its purpose. But in terms of something that is holistic, that really honors what works on a deep level and kind of through all of the other levels of human society, I don't see it. And I know that it's latest iteration, like compared to times of the past, there's so many benefits to living in our human culture today. I'm just suggesting that those benefits may not outweigh the downside. And I think it's hard for us to see because we're attached to our comforts. We're attached to having a medical system that can intervene and save our lives. We're attached to having the food that we want when we want it, at the push of a button. We're attached to having, any item in the world delivered to us the next day from Amazon. I had a conversation with someone in Vancouver a while back, and we were talking about, changing the system, changing the society, and what he was advocating for was everyone in the world getting what they want. Everyone should have this great lifestyle. And I thought to myself, not only do I not believe in that, it's so not functional. Like there's so much wastage, there's so much overuse of resources. There's a totally unsustainable system right now. And his thought was to add the 7.5 billion people of the world to a baseline of prosperity and comfort that he believes he should have and that everyone else should have. And it's sort of a misguided utopian view that everyone should have everything all the time and none of the bad stuff. In a way, it's childish, but in some ways, I think we're still quite attached to that paradigm. There is something in it that makes sense to me, which is currently we have a highly kind of exclusive access to resources. It's a very steep pyramid in terms of who the haves and have-nots of the world. And most of that is based on greed. I'm not down with that. I really would love to see more humanism in the world of wealth generation, wealth accumulation. And it doesn't mean I don't think some people are have a right to what they've earned. Like I've done very little in my life and had very little, and I've done more in my life and had more. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just that the nature of the distribution of wealth right now and the way in which wealth is controlled and used to control systems, to me is disastrous. Not just to the people who don't have. It's disastrous to the people that are implementing that, because in some way they have to separate from their own heart to pollute in that way, to destroy in that way. So, and again, it all comes back to this. I think about Trump. I think about, there is a human there. Of all the caricatures and the memes and the ridiculous things that people say about him, he's a human being, and he's doing what he's doing for his own reasons. And a transformation could happen there. I truly believe Trump could have an awakening and transform his life. Is it likely? No, I wouldn't bet my house on it, but it's possible. And that's heartening for me, to know that someone like, say, Putin or Trump could actually transform themselves in their life, live a totally different way. That's my faith. That's my faith in life, and that's my faith in humanity. And I know that my only access point to bringing that faith to life is first in me, and then in how I live my life.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's perfect. Yeah. So living your life in that sense, do you find that a lot of people are starting to mirror how you live your life? People around you?
I mean, I get a lot of feedback about people feeling supported by me, people feeling inspired by me. You get everything. As you put yourself out into the world more and more, you get more of all the feedback. So I definitely also get my fair share of critique, people challenging my thoughts and ideas. I was quite sensitive to that when I was younger. I wanted people to like me. I wanted people to like what I had to say. And that censored me in ways that I was aware of, and also in ways that I wasn't aware of. And more, I recognized that if I'm going to be fully expressed, and if I'm going to be a genuine, healthy contribution to a world that means something to me, that's just part of the deal, that I put myself out, and I am willing to receive people's responses to that. I worked with youth for years, and one of the beautiful things about social media has been that every once in a while, a youth that I worked with like 15, 20 years ago will message me, and they'll say something like, "Hey, Dolphin, I just want you to know that I was having a really rough time when you worked with me, and our relationship, or that time we went on that trip, or that program that you ran made a real difference for me. Thank you." And I know that those moments of transformation, those moments of interpersonal transformation, are constantly happening, and mostly we don't see the fruit of the transformation. And I think that's why it's so important for us to be relational instead of transactional with our giving to the world, with our expression into the world. It's like, do it because it's your love. Don't do it so that you can wait and see how that landed or how that changed someone or something. It's fine if you get that feedback and it nourishes you. But if you wait for that, or if you're afraid that it doesn't turn out well, you'll censor yourself. You'll in some way hold back your full expression, which essentially is holding back your full love.
It sounds like you're describing Donald Trump.
In what way? Well, the opposite of that?
No, he is that. I mean, he doesn't censor himself based on opinion. I mean, there might be fruit here that we don't see.
I mean, I would say he is willing to put himself out. That is for sure. My question or critique of him might be the motive for it.
Right.
What is that kind of? It's like people talk about radical honesty, and there's a place for a kind of honesty that is not afraid to be fully expressed. But the radical honesty can easily be used as a mechanism to be insensitive or callous or a jerk. So again, where is it coming from? What's the real motive for it? And if it's love, if it's connectedness, if it's relationship, that's a beautiful thing.
So, Dolphin Kasper, if people want to find you, where do they find you?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm very easy to find. There's only one Dolphin Kasper. It's with a K, Kasper. So all the social media platforms, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. You can reach me on there at Dolphin Kasper. And then I have a website, evolvenowinc.com. So EVOLVENOWINC.com. And that's my business coaching website. And really my focus is around transformation of the person, of the interpersonal, and of the superpersonal. So it's communication based, but it's very much about the transforming of the present moment and accessing possibility.
Awesome. Awesome. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. We have not ever talked this much. We met each other at a festival, and here we are, probably like 3 or 4 years later. I don't know.
I love that about technology, just how we are connected, and how easy it is to reach out and touch into relationship with technology. I've been appreciating that, and especially right now with everyone, more with their devices to connect. It's been sweet. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. This podcast is Expansion Cast. Thank you for listening.